Peter Spencer spent a lot of his time learning about the law, so he took the government to court. At one stage, the government made an offer to buy his land after the land clearing restrictions came into place, but the price offered was based on the property's present value. Peter Spencer argued it should be on the value that the land had before the clearing bans were put in place. In the Supreme Court in 2008, Mr. Justice Stephen Rothman expressed sympathy for Mr. Spencer's predicament, saying, quote, "The State Vegetation Act has had a crippling effect on the business of Mr. Spencer. It is an extremely disheartening and sad occasion that a person whose life and resources have been placed into rural property for the purposes of conducting a grazing and farming business has been required to resort to this action." Mr. Justice Rothman went on, "While all members of society must accept that there will be restrictions on their activities for the greater good of society, when those restrictions prevent or prohibit a business activity that was hitherto legitimate because of the area in which it's operating, and assistance is offered which does not fully compensate for the restrictions imposed, society is asking Mr. Spencer and people in his position to pay for its benefit." He said, it is a most unfortunate aspect of the operation of the scheme that a person in Mr. Spencer's position is effectively denied proper compensation for the restrictions imposed upon him by a scheme implemented for the public good. That is the Supreme Court of New South Wales. Unfortunately, Mr. Justice Rothman then concluded that, though, he said, is a matter for government, not the courts, which is why we're here today. Because native vegetation acts are state laws, and state constitutions do not require state governments to pay compensation for property that they take. But these laws were enacted by the state of New South Wales at the behest of the federal government. The native vegetation laws have allowed Canberra to meet its Kyoto greenhouse emissions target without the hassle of paying those who own the native vegetation carbon sinks, and that's the guts of why we're here today. And this mountain of regulation is eroding one of our basic human rights, the right to own property. The government hasn't literally taken your properties or Mr. Spencer's property away. He hasn't, Mr. Spencer, literally been kicked off. He can still wander his land. He still owns the title, but his right to use the land has been stolen. In other words, the government tells you you can keep your house, but you can't live in it. You technically still own it, but you bought the house, when you bought the house, you thought it would be a nice place to sleep, but the government says you can't live in it, so you don't really own it in any useful sense. This is where we are today. Farmers who are physically deprived of their land use may as well no longer own the land. What is the point if you're not allowed by government edict to farm it? And if the farmer is not compensated for this regulatory taking, how is that much different from legalised theft? Now, Kevin Rudd bangs on about prosperity and productivity and economic growth. Property rights are essential to prosperity and growth. If you can't demonstrate you've got assets to your name, it's going to be pretty hard to get a loan to start a business to guarantee any prosperity. Or as my old man would say, you buggered before you begin. Property rights are the foundation stone of social mobility. Property is just another word for accumulated savings, your savings, and a government then takes those savings. In 1948, property rights were spelt out clearly in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights by saying, quote, "No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property." We are in dangerous territory here. The Parliament of Victoria passed a Victorian Charter of Rights in 2006, which said no one's property can be taken, quote, "except in accordance with the law." So you own the property, but you don't. Just imagine saying that to BHP. They'd be excited, wouldn't they? The Peter Spencer story is about a man defending his right to property. It's pretty simple. It is a right which your presence here today demonstrates quite clearly that you believe is increasingly ignored. Mr Rudd's been able to trot around the world arguing that Australia has met its carbon emissions reduction target under the Kyoto Protocol by the 22% it was meant to meet. If it hadn't met that target, Mr Rudd's government would have faced billions of dollars in compliance penalties by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, we know what a pack of liars the climate change mob have proved to be, and in... And the polls today indicate that Australians increasingly are beginning to understand that. Increasingly, Massachusetts, here we come. Increasingly, the International Government Panel on Climate Change have demonstrated that much of their science has been doctored, but that's another story. But basically, Kevin Rudd got to his targets by asking the states to implement native vegetation laws. State constitutions don't require compensation, so farmers' land has been declared effectively a carbon sink with no compensation payable. The land has been stolen and the farmer has no rights to use it. Yet, Kevin Rudd has got a lump of legislation which is going to shove in the Parliament again this week, where he's prepared to provide billions of dollars under that carbon pollution reduction scheme to compensate carbon polluters, but the victims of his climate change policy get nothing. What has happened here? It is the same as locking up 109 million hectares of Australian families' private property under vegetation management laws. 109 million. The government says this is sterile for production. Leave it alone, farmers can't use it. So basically, affected farming families across the country have paid for Kevin Rudd's carbon emissions reduction scheme, and that's the only reason Mr Rudd's been able to strut the stage in Copenhagen saying Australia has met its Kyoto Treaty obligations. Australia's national greenhouse gas accounts show that farmers, by reducing broad-scale land clearing rates since 1990, have offset substantial increases in greenhouse gas emissions from other sectors, mainly energy. And an official federal government projection has shown that without broad-scale land clearing reductions, Australia's greenhouse emissions would be 30% above 1990 levels by 2010. In other words, Australian farmers have been responsible for virtually the entire share of the nation's greenhouse gas emission reductions, but their efforts worth billions of dollars have not been recognised or financially rewarded by the government.